A question that stops a stranger cold. The dying woman's daughter looked up at the drifter with eyes that had seen too much sorrow for someone so young and asked the question that would change 3 lives forever. Sir, will you marry my mother so she doesn't die sad? Caleb Hart froze mid-step, his hand still gripping the reins of his dust-covered mare, because in all his years of running from one frontier town to another, no one had ever asked him to stay for something that mattered. This is the story of how a broken soldier, a fading light, and a child's desperate hope became the kind of family that chooses itself, the kind built not on blood or obligation, but on the raw courage to stop running from pain and finally face it head on. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far Lucy's question travels across this country. The cabin appeared through the cottonwood grove like a memory half forgotten. Weathered planks, silvered by mountain sun, a stone chimney listing slightly westward, and a porch that sagged in the middle as if tired of holding itself upright. Caleb Hart noticed these details the way a man notices scars on his own hands, automatically, without affection. He'd seen 100 such places scattered across the Colorado frontier, each one a testament to hope meeting reality and losing the fight. His mare's hooves crunched through dead leaves as he approached, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness of late afternoon. October had painted the aspens gold and amber, but here in the shadow of the cabin, everything looked gray. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the chill creeping into the air. No chickens scratched in the yard. The vegetable garden had gone mostly to seed, though someone had tried to stake the tomatoes before giving up halfway through. Caleb told himself he'd only stop long enough to water his horse at the creek he'd spotted beyond the tree line. Maybe ask permission to camp nearby if anyone was home. He'd been riding for 3 days straight, pushing west from Denver with no particular destination except away. That had been his compass for 2 years now, away from the war, away from the memories, away from the man he'd been before Shiloh turned the Tennessee River red. He dismounted slowly, his back protesting the movement. 31 years old and already moving like his father had in his 50s. The horse snorted, shaking her head so the bit jangled. "I know, girl," Caleb murmured, running a hand down her neck. "Just a quick stop." That's when he saw the child. She sat on the porch steps like she'd been waiting, not for him specifically, but for someone. Anyone. A girl of maybe 8 or 9, wearing a faded calico dress that had been let out at the hem more than once. Her hair, the color of wheat ready for harvest, was plaited into a single braid that hung over her shoulder. Her feet were bare despite the cold, and she held a book in her lap, one finger marking her place. What struck Caleb most were her eyes. They watched him with a stillness that had nothing to do with shyness and everything to do with assessment. This child had learned early to measure strangers against some internal scale of threat and utility. "Afternoon," Caleb said, keeping his distance. He knew how he must look, trail-worn, unshaven, a man whose clothes had seen better months. "Didn't mean to intrude. Just wondering if I might water my horse at your creek before moving on." The girl studied him for a long moment. Then she closed her book carefully, using a scrap of ribbon to mark her place, and stood. She was small for her age, he thought, too thin. "Are you married, sir?" Her voice was clear and direct, with the careful diction of someone who'd been taught proper grammar and still cared about using it. The question caught him off guard. "No, miss, I'm not." "Are you a good man?" Caleb felt something twist in his chest. That's a harder question to answer. "But you're thinking about it," the girl observed. "That's something. Bad men don't think about it at all." She came down the steps, moving with the deliberate grace of someone accustomed to avoiding creaking boards. Up close, he could see the violet shadows under her eyes, the way her dress hung loose at the shoulders. This child wasn't eating enough, wasn't sleeping enough. "My name is Lucy Hale," she said, extending her hand with unexpected formality. "My mother is inside. She's resting." Caleb shook her hand gently, feeling the delicate bones beneath skin too pale. "Caleb Hart, Miss Lucy. Pleased to make your acquaintance." "You said you're not married, Mr. Hart?" Lucy hadn't released his hand. She held it between both of hers now, looking up at him with those 2 old eyes. "Do you have family somewhere? People waiting for you?" "No, miss." The truth came easier than he'd expected. "It's just me and the horse." Lucy nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. "Mr. Hart, I need to ask you something important, and I need you to think about your answer before you give it." Every instinct screamed at Caleb to mount his horse and ride. Nothing good came from getting tangled in other people's troubles. He'd learned that lesson hard in Kansas, and again outside Santa Fe. A drifter stayed a drifter by knowing when to move on. But those eyes held him fixed like a nail through wood. "All right," he heard himself say. Lucy took a breath, squaring her small shoulders. "Sir, will you marry my mother so she doesn't die sad?" The world seemed to tilt slightly. Caleb was aware of the wind in the aspens, the creak of old leather as his horse shifted weight, the smell of wood smoke from somewhere distant. But Lucy's question hung in the air between them like something physical, something he could almost reach out and touch. His voice came out rough. He cleared his throat. "Miss Lucy, I don't understand what you're asking me." "Yes, you do." She said it gently, without accusation. "You understand exactly what I'm asking. You just don't know why I'm asking it yet." Before he could respond, the cabin door opened. A woman stood in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame as if she needed its support. She was younger than Caleb had expected, perhaps his own age, though illness had carved lines around her mouth and eyes that spoke of pain borne quietly. Her hair, the same wheat gold as her daughter's, was pinned loosely at the nape of her neck. She wore a simple gray dress, clean but threadbare at the cuffs. What arrested Caleb's attention was her face. Even worn down by whatever sickness had claimed her, she was beautiful, not in the way of magazine illustrations or dance hall girls, but with the kind of beauty that came from character carved deep. High cheekbones, a mouth made for smiling despite current circumstances, and eyes the color of sage after rain. Those eyes widened when they found him standing in her yard. Lucy Evangeline Hale. The woman's voice was soft but carried the unmistakable weight of maternal authority. "What have you done?" "I asked a stranger a question, Mama." Lucy didn't sound repentant. "An important question." The woman, Evelyn, Caleb assumed, closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, they'd taken on the practiced brightness of someone accustomed to apologizing for circumstances beyond their control. "Sir, I'm terribly sorry. My daughter has an active imagination. Please don't let her peculiar questions trouble you. You're welcome to water your horse, and if you need a place to camp tonight, you're welcome to use the clearing by the creek, but Lucy will not be bothering you further." She swayed slightly, and Lucy was at her side in an instant, small arms supporting her mother with practiced efficiency. "I should get Mama back to bed," Lucy said to Caleb, but her eyes held his with unmistakable intensity. "But Mr. Hart, I meant what I asked. Please think about it." They disappeared into the cabin before he could respond. The door closed with a soft click that felt impossibly final. Caleb stood in the yard for a long moment, listening to the aspens whisper overhead. The smart thing would be to water his horse and ride out. He'd done the smart thing 100 times before. It was how he'd survived this long. But the question followed him as he led his mare to the creek. "Will you marry my mother so she doesn't die sad? Not save her. Not help her. Just keep her from dying sad." What kind of child thought to ask that? What kind of desperation bred such a question? The creek ran clear and cold over smooth stones. Caleb let the mare drink her fill while he crouched at the bank, splashing water on his face and neck. The shock of it helped clear his head a little, though Lucy's words still echoed. He'd seen plenty of hard cases during the war and after. Widows, orphans, families torn apart by violence or disease or simple bad luck. The frontier was littered with broken people trying to hold broken things together. He'd helped where he could, fixed a wagon wheel here, chopped firewood there, left a few dollars under a plate before riding away. Small kindnesses that cost him nothing but time. But this was different. This was a child asking him to marry a dying woman. The sheer audacity of it left him breathless. The mare finished drinking and nuzzled his shoulder, leaving a wet spot on his shirt. "Yeah," Caleb muttered. "I know, we should go." But the sun was already sinking toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and rose. He'd been planning to camp anyway, and there was that clearing Lucy's mother had mentioned, the one by the creek. No harm in staying the night. Come morning, he'd ride out, and this would just be another strange story in a life full of them. He unsaddled the mare and hobbled her where she could graze, then gathered deadfall for a fire. As twilight deepened, he built it up and set coffee to boil in his battered tin pot. The familiar routine steadied him: measure the grounds, add water from his canteen, wait for the boil. Mr. Hart? He turned to find Lucy approaching through the gathering dark, carrying a covered dish wrapped in a faded kitchen towel. Your mother know you're out here? Caleb asked. She sent me. Lucy handed him the dish. Said it's not proper to let a stranger go hungry when we have food to share. Caleb unwrapped the towel to find cornbread, still warm, and a small jar of honey. His throat tightened unexpectedly. That's kind of her. Of you both. There's stew, too, if you'd like to come up to the house. Lucy settled herself on a log near the fire without waiting for invitation. Mama made it this afternoon. She has good days and bad days. Today was good. Caleb sat across from her, breaking off a piece of cornbread. It was dense and slightly sweet, made with real cornmeal instead of the adulterated stuff some traders sold. Your mother's a fine cook. She's good at everything. Pride rang clear in Lucy's voice. She can sew and garden and keep accounts. She taught me to read from her own books. She knows poetry and mathematics and the names of all the constellations. Sounds like a remarkable woman. She is. Lucy poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. That's why it isn't fair. Caleb knew he shouldn't ask, but the words came anyway. What isn't fair? That she's dying. That she's dying alone, thinking she failed somehow. Lucy's voice remained steady, but her hands clenched tight around the stick. That the man who promised to love her left when things got hard, and now she's going to die believing she wasn't worth staying for. The bluntness of it hit Caleb like a fist. He set down the cornbread, appetite suddenly gone. Lucy? Her name is Evelyn, the girl interrupted. Evelyn Rose Hale. She was Evelyn Rose Morrison before she married my father, but he doesn't deserve to have his name attached to hers anymore, so I don't use it. Where is your father? California, I think. Maybe Oregon. Somewhere gold was supposed to be easier to find than here. Lucy's jaw set in a way that made her look heartbreakingly adult. He left 2 years ago, right after the doctor told Mama about the tumor. Said he couldn't watch her waste away, that it was too hard. Promised he'd send money once he struck it rich. Did he? What do you think, Mr. Hart? Caleb had no answer for that. Men like Lucy's father were common as dirt out here. Big dreamers with small spines, always chasing the next easy fortune while leaving destruction in their wake. Mama sold almost everything to pay the doctor, Lucy continued, her voice taking on the mechanical quality of a story told too many times. The good furniture, her mother's silver, my father's tools that he left behind. We kept the cabin because it's all we have. She takes in mending when she's well enough, and I help with the garden and chickens, though most of the chickens died last winter. Lucy, why are you telling me this? The girl looked at him with those ancient eyes. Because you need to understand what I'm asking. I'm not asking you to save us, Mr. Hart. Mama's too proud for that, and besides, I know how men are about saving. They want gratitude and worship, and someone looking at them like they hung the moon. That's a hard view of people. It's an honest one, Lucy shrugged. But I don't think you're that kind of man. You looked uncomfortable when I asked my question, but you didn't laugh. You didn't get angry. You thought about it. Caleb rubbed his face with both hands. What you're asking isn't possible, Lucy. I'm a stranger. I have nothing to offer. I can barely take care of myself, much less— I'm not asking you to take care of us, Lucy interrupted. I'm asking you to let Mama die knowing she mattered to someone, that she was worth choosing, even if it's a lie, even if it's just for a little while. The simplicity of it was devastating. How long? Caleb asked quietly. How long does she have? The doctor said weeks, maybe a month or two if winter's mild. Lucy's composure finally cracked, just slightly. Her voice wavered. But I can see it getting worse. Some days she can barely get out of bed. The pain medicine helps, but we're almost out. Caleb thought about riding away at dawn. He thought about the empty horizon and the nameless towns and the loneliness he'd worn like armor for so long. He thought about a woman named Evelyn teaching her daughter to read by lamplight, keeping accounts for a future she wouldn't see. dying alone except for a child too young to carry such weight. I can stay a day or two, he heard himself say. Chop wood, make repairs. But Lucy, what you're asking, marriage, that's not something I can promise. A day or two is more than most would offer. Lucy stood, brushing dirt from her dress. Will you come up for supper? Mama would like to thank you properly. I don't think that's a good idea. Please, Mr. Hart. Now she sounded like what she was, a frightened child. She has so few good days left, let her use one of them to practice being a hostess again, to feel normal for an hour. How could he refuse that? All right, Caleb said. Give me a minute to wash up. Lucy's smile transformed her face, and for a moment he saw what she must have looked like before sorrow aged her, bright and quick, and full of the mischief proper to childhood. She ran back toward the cabin, and Caleb was left alone with his fire and his thoughts, and a decision that terrified him more than Confederate artillery ever had. The cabin's interior was spare but scrupulously clean. A table with 3 chairs, 1 rocker by the hearth, a narrow bed in the corner where Lucy slept. The main room served as kitchen, living area, and dining room all at once. A ladder led to a loft above, presumably where Evelyn slept. The table had been set with mismatched plates and cups, but someone had put wildflowers in a jar at the center, autumn asters, purple and gold. Evelyn stood at the stove, stirring a pot that filled the cabin with the rich smell of venison stew. She'd changed into a different dress, this one a faded blue that brought out the color of her eyes. She'd pinned her hair up more carefully, and there was a spot of color in her cheeks that might have been fever, or might have been rouge carefully applied. Caleb suspected the latter, and the effort she'd made struck him as both heartbreaking and admirable. Mr. Hart. She turned from the stove, offering a smile that reached her eyes despite the exhaustion pulling at her features. Thank you for joining us. I hope Lucy didn't bully you too terribly. Not at all, ma'am. Caleb removed his hat, suddenly aware of how rough he must look. He'd washed his face and hands at the creek, but there was no disguising 3 days of trail dust and 2 weeks of stubble. I appreciate the hospitality. Please, sit. Evelyn gestured to the table. Lucy, fetch the butter from the spring house. The girl obeyed quickly, and Caleb found himself alone with Evelyn. She moved carefully between stove and table, her breath catching slightly with the effort. He resisted the urge to help, sensing she needed to do this herself. I must apologize for my daughter's extraordinary question earlier, Evelyn said as she ladled stew into bowls. She's been under considerable strain, and sometimes her imagination runs away with her good sense. She's trying to take care of you. Yes. Evelyn's hand trembled slightly as she set down the ladle. But she's a child, and I'm the one who should be caring for her, not the other way around. Sometimes we don't get to choose who carries the weight. Evelyn looked at him sharply, and he saw intelligence there along with the pain. You speak from experience, Mr. Hart. Some. Lucy returned with butter in a small crock, and they sat together at the table. Evelyn said a brief, simple grace, thanking the land for its bounty, asking for strength for the days ahead. Caleb noticed she didn't ask to be healed. She'd already moved past that hope. The stew was excellent, tender meat, root vegetables, herbs that suggested Evelyn knew her way around wild plants as well as garden varieties. They ate mostly in silence at first, the quiet broken only by the crackle of fire in the hearth and the soft clink of spoons against bowls. This is fine cooking, ma'am, Caleb said. Best I've had in months. You're kind to say so. Evelyn broke her cornbread into small pieces, eating slowly. I'm afraid our hospitality is somewhat limited these days, but what we have, we share gladly. Mama used to host dinners, Lucy offered, before Papa left. People would come from miles around because she was such a good cook, and the house was always so pretty with flowers and candles. Lucy, Evelyn's voice carried a gentle warning. It's true, Mama. You made everything beautiful. Lucy turned to Caleb. She can make a whole meal from things other people would throw away. And she knows all the wild plants, which ones are good for medicine, which ones are poisonous, which ones make the best dye for fabric. Evelyn's cheeks colored, and Caleb recognized a woman unused to being the center of attention in this way. Not anymore. My mother taught me. She was half Ute, half French. She believed in knowing the land we lived on. Smart woman, Caleb said. She was. Evelyn's expression softened with memory. She and my father ran a trading post up near the Wyoming border before the territory opened up more. I grew up speaking 3 languages, learning to read both French poetry and account ledgers. Mama speaks French and some Ute, Lucy said proudly, and she taught me all the constellations in Latin. Caleb found himself smiling despite everything. Sounds like you're getting a better education than most folks in finishing schools. I want Lucy to have choices I didn't have, Evelyn said quietly. I want her to know that learning opens doors, that she doesn't have to depend on anyone to define her worth. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning Caleb understood too well. This was a woman who'd made her own choices and been betrayed by them, who'd loved wrong and paid the price but still wanted better for her daughter. Mr. Hart, Evelyn said after a moment, Lucy tells me you're traveling west. Do you have employment waiting or family? No, ma'am, just writing. And before that? Her eyes searched his face. Were you a soldier? He should have expected the question. Most men his age bore some mark of the war, whether in body or bearing. Yes, ma'am. Union cavalry. I thought so. You have the look. She didn't elaborate on what that look was, but Caleb knew. The watchfulness, the stillness that came from learning to sleep with one ear always open, the way his eyes tracked movements without conscious thought. The war's been over 5 years, he said, but some of us are still trying to figure out what comes after. And what do you think comes after, Mr. Hart? It was a real question, asked with genuine interest, and Caleb found himself answering honestly. I don't know yet. I thought I'd find it somewhere out here in the territory. Thought maybe if I kept moving, I'd recognize it when I saw it. And have you? No, ma'am. Evelyn nodded slowly. Lucy, would you clear the dishes, please? And there's a bit of dried apple pie in the cupboard for Mr. Hart, if he'd like. Lucy obeyed, and again Caleb found himself alone with Evelyn. She folded her hands on the table, and he noticed how thin her fingers were, the knuckles too prominent. Mr. Hart, I'm going to be direct with you, because I don't have the luxury of time for polite circumlocution. Her voice was steady, matter-of-fact. I'm dying. The tumor in my abdomen is inoperable, and it's growing. I have perhaps 6 to 8 weeks left, possibly less. I tell you this not to elicit sympathy, but because I believe my daughter asked you a terrible question this afternoon, and you deserve to understand the full context before you flee, as any sensible person would. Caleb met her eyes and didn't look away. She asked me to marry you so you wouldn't die sad. Yes? Evelyn's composure cracked just slightly. I'm mortified beyond measure, Mr. Hart. A child shouldn't have to think such thoughts, much less voice them to a stranger. But Lucy has shouldered burdens no child should carry, and this is how she's trying to protect me. By finding someone, anyone, to stand beside me at the end. Why does she think you're dying sad? The question surprised her. She blinked, and he saw tears gather at the corners of her eyes before she forced them back through sheer will. Because she hears me cry at night, Evelyn whispered. Because she knows I lie awake wondering what will happen to her after I'm gone. Because she's 8 years old and smart enough to understand that I'm terrified, not of dying, but of leaving her alone in a world that won't be kind to an orphaned girl with no money and no family. She has you until the end. That's more than a lot of children get. Is it? Evelyn's laugh was bitter. I gave her stability, Mr. Hart, and then I'm going to take it away by dying. I gave her a father who abandoned her. I gave her a childhood defined by illness and poverty and fear. What kind of mother does that make me? The kind who's doing her best with what she's got. My best wasn't enough. The words came out broken, and this time the tears fell. Evelyn wiped them away impatiently with the heel of her hand. I'm sorry. You don't need to see this. You don't need to be part of any of this. Please, finish your meal and go. Forget Lucy's question. We'll manage somehow. But Caleb didn't move. He sat watching this woman cry and refuse comfort in equal measure, and something in his chest that had been frozen since Shiloh began, very slowly, to thaw. What would it look like? He asked quietly. Evelyn froze. What? If I said yes, what would it actually look like? Mr. Hart, I'm not saying yes, he clarified quickly, But I'm not saying no either. I'm asking what you'd need, what Lucy needs. Evelyn stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. I don't know. I never thought. Lucy shouldn't have asked. This is unconscionable. Maybe. But she did ask. And here we are. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on the table. So tell me, if I stayed, not forever, just until, what would that look like? Evelyn drew a shaking breath, her hands twisting together in her lap. The fire popped in the hearth, and somewhere outside an owl called into the darkness. She looked at Caleb as if trying to determine whether he was real or some fever dream conjured from desperation. I would need you to be kind to Lucy, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Not to love her, I know that's asking too much, but to be patient with her, to let her grieve without telling her to be strong or brave, or any of those hollow words people use when they don't know what else to say. All right. I would need you to stay until the end. Not to leave when it gets ugly, because it will get ugly, Mr. Hart. The tumor will steal everything from me piece by piece, my dignity, my strength, my ability to care for myself. I'll need help with things that should shame me, and I'll hate every moment of it. I've seen men die hard, Caleb said quietly. The war taught me that death doesn't wait for us to be ready, and it rarely comes gentle. I'm not afraid of ugly. Evelyn studied his face for a long moment, and he let her look. Whatever she was searching for, he hoped she found enough of it to continue. There's money hidden in the loft, she said. Not much, but enough for a proper burial and maybe 3 months' worth of supplies for Lucy. I have a sister in St. Louis, Catherine Morrison. She married well, and I've written to her about taking Lucy when the time comes. She hasn't responded, but I keep hoping. And if she doesn't respond? Evelyn's face crumpled. Then I die knowing I've failed my daughter completely, that I'm leaving her to orphanages or worse. She pressed her fingers to her temples. Do you know what they do to girls with no family, Mr. Hart? Especially girls who are educated enough to be useful but have no money or connections? They become governesses if they're lucky, servants if they're not. And if they're very unlucky, don't, Caleb interrupted. Don't go down that road. But I have to. Every night I lie awake going down that road, imagining every terrible possibility, because that's what mothers do when they're dying. We torture ourselves with futures we won't be there to prevent. Lucy appeared at the top of the ladder with 2 plates of pie, her timing so perfect that Caleb suspected she'd been listening the whole time. She descended carefully, balancing both plates, and set them on the table with deliberate care. Mama, she said, you're scaring him. Good. He should be scared. This is a terrifying thing Evelyn stopped herself. That we're asking of him. Lucy sat down and pushed one of the pie plates toward Caleb. Mr. Hart doesn't scare easy, Mama. I can tell. Is that so? Evelyn's mouth twitched toward something that might have been a smile under different circumstances. Yes. Lucy picked up her fork with perfect table manners, waiting until Caleb had picked up his before taking a bite. Scared men don't stop to water their horses when they could just keep riding. They don't accept dinner invitations from strange women, and they definitely don't ask what it would look like to stay. Caleb tasted the pie, dried apples with cinnamon, and just enough sugar to take the edge off the tartness. It was simple food, but made with care. You're a perceptive young lady, Miss Lucy. I have to be. She said it without pride or self-pity, just stating fact. They ate their pie in silence that felt less awkward than it should have. Caleb found himself aware of small details, the way Evelyn ate slowly, as if each bite required conscious effort, the way Lucy watched her mother with constant vigilance, tracking every wince, every pause, the way the lamplight caught in Evelyn's hair, turning it to spun gold despite the gray threading through it. Mr. Hart, Evelyn said when they'd finished, I'm going to tell you something true, and I need you to believe me. I don't want you to marry me because you feel sorry for us. Pity is poison. It curdles everything it touches. If you're going to stay, it needs to be for a better reason than that. What would be a better reason? I don't know. She laughed, the sound edged with exhaustion. Maybe because you're tired of running and this seems like as good a place as any to stop for a while. Maybe because you want to do something decent before you keep drifting west. Maybe just because saying yes feels slightly less terrifying than saying no. Caleb set down his fork. You asking me this, or talking yourself into it? Both. Evelyn met his eyes. I won't lie and say this is anything more than what it is, a dying woman trying to give her daughter one last gift, the gift of believing her mother was loved at the end. But Mr. Hart, I will not trap you here with guilt or obligation. You need to know you can walk away. Tomorrow, next week, whenever it becomes too much. I won't blame you, and I'll make sure Lucy doesn't either. That's not much of a marriage. No, Evelyn agreed. It's not. It's a kindness dressed up in wedding vows to make a little girl feel better. But sometimes kindness is all we have. Lucy had been sitting very still, her hands folded in her lap, but now she looked up at Caleb with those ancient eyes. Do you have somewhere else you need to be, Mr. Hart? The question cut straight to the heart of it. Did he have somewhere else to be? Some purpose pulling him west with such urgency that he couldn't spare 6 weeks for a dying woman and her daughter? The truth was, he'd been running for 2 years with no destination in mind. Running from memories that followed no matter how far he rode. Running from the man he'd been before the war carved out everything soft inside him and left only scar tissue. Running because staying still meant facing what he'd become. No, Miss Lucy, he said quietly. I don't have anywhere else I need to be. Then will you stay, please? Evelyn reached over and took her daughter's hand. Lucy, love, you can't ask. Why not? Lucy's voice rose slightly, the careful composure finally cracking. Why can't I ask? You're dying, Mama, and I can't stop it. I can't make you better no matter how hard I try. But maybe I can make it less lonely. Maybe I can give you this one thing, someone choosing to stay when they could leave. Tears streamed down her face now, and she didn't bother wiping them away. You think I don't know what you cry about at night? You think I can't hear you apologizing to the air for leaving me? You're dying believing you failed, and that's not true, and I need you to know it's not true before you go. Evelyn pulled Lucy into her lap, no easy feat given her weakened state, and held her while she sobbed. The girl's grief poured out in great heaving gasps, and Caleb felt like an intruder on something too raw to witness. He started to stand, to give them privacy, but Evelyn's eyes caught his. Don't go, she mouthed over Lucy's head. So Caleb sat back down and waited while a child cried for her dying mother, and a mother held her daughter and tried to be strong enough for both of them. He thought about all the people he'd left behind after the war, brothers in arms he'd never checked on, women who'd looked at him with hope he couldn't return, towns he'd passed through without leaving any trace of himself behind. He thought about how easy it had been to keep moving, to avoid exactly this kind of moment where people needed him to be more than just a passing stranger. When Lucy's sobs finally quieted to hiccups, Evelyn smoothed her daughter's hair back from her face. Better? Lucy nodded against her mother's shoulder. Good. Now, you need to let Mr. Hart think about this. We can't force him, and we can't make him feel guilty for whatever he decides. Do you understand? Yes, Mama. Good girl. Evelyn kissed the top of her head. Why don't you get ready for bed? I'll be up to tuck you in shortly. Lucy climbed down from her mother's lap and disappeared up the ladder without another word. Caleb heard the soft sounds of her moving around in the loft above, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of fabric, the whisper of blankets being pulled back. Evelyn stood slowly, bracing herself against the table. Her face had gone gray with exhaustion, and Caleb could see the effort it took for her to remain upright. Thank you for dinner, ma'am, he said, standing as well. And for the conversation. Thank you for not running the moment my daughter asked her impossible question. Evelyn managed a real smile this time, small but genuine. You're a better man than most, Caleb Hart. I hope you know that. I'm not sure I do. Well, maybe that's something you need to figure out. She moved toward the ladder, each step measured and careful. The clearing by the creek is sheltered if the wind picks up tonight, and there's more wood stacked on the north side of the cabin if you need it for your fire. I'll manage. Thank you. She paused at the base of the ladder, one hand on the rung. Caleb. May I call you Caleb? Yes, ma'am. I'm Evelyn, just Evelyn, and I want you to know something. She didn't turn to face him, just spoke to the ladder in front of her. Whatever you decide, you've already given us something. You treated my daughter like a person instead of a problem. You sat at my table and didn't look at me like I was already dead. Those are gifts, even if they don't feel like much to you. Then she climbed the ladder slowly, and Caleb stood alone in the cabin's main room, listening to the soft murmur of mother and daughter saying goodnight above him. He let himself out quietly and walked back to his campsite through darkness broken only by starlight. The fire had burned down to coals, but he built it back up and sat watching flames dance against the night sky. His horse nickered softly from where she was hobbled nearby. "Yeah, girl," Caleb muttered. "We're in trouble now." Because the truth was, he'd already decided. Somewhere between Lucy's impossible question and Evelyn's honest tears and the dried apple pie that tasted like someone still cared about small beauties, he'd stopped thinking about leaving. The question now was what kind of man he wanted to be. The kind who rode away from people who needed him because it was easier, or the kind who stayed even when staying was hard. He'd been the first kind for 2 years. Maybe it was time to see what the second kind looked like. Sleep came eventually, though his dreams were full of hospital tents and men crying for mothers who weren't there. He woke before dawn with frost on his bedroll and his breath misting in the cold air. The mountain stood black against a sky just beginning to lighten in the east. Caleb built up the fire and set coffee to boil, then walked down to the creek to wash. The water was so cold it made his teeth ache, but it cleared his head. He shaved carefully with his straight razor, using the still water as a mirror, and changed into the cleaner of his 2 shirts. When he returned to camp, Lucy was sitting by his fire with 2 tin cups waiting for the coffee to brew. "Morning, Mr. Hart." "Morning, Miss Lucy." He poured coffee for them both, noticing she took hers with a liberal amount of sugar from a small tin she'd brought. "Your mama know you're out here? She's still sleeping. She sleeps late on bad mornings." Lucy wrapped both hands around her cup, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "I wanted to apologize for crying last night. That wasn't fair to you." You don't need to apologize for having feelings, Lucy. Mama says a lady keeps her composure even under duress." Caleb smiled despite himself. "Your mama sounds like someone who's had to be strong for a long time. But being strong doesn't mean never crying. It means crying when you need to and then getting up the next morning anyway." Lucy considered this, taking a careful sip of her coffee. "Is that what you do? Cry when you need to and get up anyway?" "Not as often as I should, probably." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky lighten and listening to birds begin their morning songs. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and Caleb's horse answered with a soft whinny. "Mr. Hart," Lucy said eventually, "I need to tell you something true about my mother." "All right." "She's not afraid of dying. She's made her peace with it, I think. What she's afraid of is that her whole life will have added up to nothing. That she married wrong and died young, and all she'll leave behind is a daughter who'll forget her eventually." "You won't forget her." "No, but I'm just one person, and I'm 8 years old. What if that's not enough?" Lucy's voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "What if the only thing that proves someone mattered is having someone choose them? Not because they have to, but because they want to." Caleb set down his coffee cup. "Lucy, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honest. All right? Do you understand what you're really asking me to do? This isn't a fairy tale. Your mama's still going to die. Me staying doesn't change that. And after, everything's going to be different. And different might be harder than what you've got now." "I know." Lucy met his eyes without flinching. "I'm not asking you to save us, Mr. Hart. I'm asking you to stay long enough that Mama doesn't die thinking she was easy to leave. That's all." The simplicity of it broke something in Caleb's chest. Not asking for rescue or salvation or happy endings, just asking for someone to choose to stay when leaving would be easier. He'd spent 2 years being the man who left. Maybe it was time to be the man who stayed. "I'll need to talk to your mother," he said. "Make sure she understands what this is and what it isn't. Set some boundaries so nobody gets hurt worse than they have to." Lucy's face transformed with hope so bright it was almost painful to witness. "Does that mean—" "It means I'm thinking about it real seriously. But Lucy, I need you to promise me something. Anything. If I stay and things get bad, when things get bad, You let yourself feel whatever you feel. Don't try to be brave for me. Don't try to take care of me the way you take care of your mama. Let me be the adult for a while. Can you do that?" Lucy bit her lip, and Caleb could see her working through the implications. Finally, she nodded. "I can try. That's all I'm asking." He stood, brushing dirt from his pants. "Now, how about you show me what needs fixing around here? If I'm going to be useful, might as well start with the practical things." They spent the morning taking inventory of the property. The chicken coop needed a new roof before winter arrived in earnest. Several fence posts had rotted through and needed replacing. The woodpile was low, and what was there needed splitting into more manageable pieces. The cabin itself was sound enough but could use fresh chinking between the logs, and one of the shutters hung crooked. Caleb made mental notes of everything, already calculating how much work each task would require. He had his tools, an axe, a saw, hammer and nails, rope. Nothing fancy, but enough to make the repairs that mattered. Lucy followed him around like a shadow, pointing out problems her mother had tried to fix herself before the illness made such work impossible. There was pride in her voice when she showed him the garden plot her mother had terraced into the hillside, making use of the slope to manage water drainage. Pride and grief tangled together in a child who understood she was showing a stranger the evidence of a woman's capable hands. "Your mama built all this herself?" Caleb asked, examining the terracing. "Her and Papa at first, but he was better at planning than doing, so mostly it was Mama. She said if you're going to live on land, you need to understand it, work with it instead of against it." "Smart woman," Caleb said, and meant it. The terracing showed knowledge of water flow and soil retention that many career farmers didn't possess. They were measuring fence posts when Evelyn appeared on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill. She moved stiffly, pain evident in every line of her body, but she'd pinned her hair up and her face was composed. "Lucy, would you fetch some eggs, please?" Her voice carried across the yard. "I thought I'd make breakfast if we have any guests this morning." It was an invitation and a question all at once. Caleb handed the measuring tape to Lucy and walked toward the cabin, aware that this conversation would determine everything that came after. Evelyn watched him approach with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not hope, exactly. Something more like resignation mixed with curiosity about which path he'd choose. "Morning, ma'am." "Evelyn," she corrected gently. "If we're going to have complicated conversations, we should at least use first names." "Fair enough. Evelyn." She gestured to the porch steps, and they sat side by side watching Lucy disappear into what remained of the chicken coop. Morning sun warmed the air slightly, though the breeze still carried the bite of coming winter. "You didn't leave," Evelyn observed. "No." "Are you going to?" Caleb turned to look at her fully. In morning light, the illness was more apparent, the hollows under her cheekbones, the way her dress hung loose on a frame that had once been fuller, the careful way she held herself to minimize pain. But he also saw the woman she must have been before sickness claimed her, strong, capable, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with delicate features and everything to do with character. "I've been thinking about your daughter's question all night," he said, "and I keep coming back to the same truth. I don't have anywhere else I need to be. No family waiting, no job calling me west, no grand purpose driving me forward, just a horse and a bedroll and a lot of miles behind me that didn't lead anywhere. That's not a reason to tie yourself to dying strangers. Maybe not, but it's also not a reason to keep running." He picked up a twig and began breaking it into small pieces. "The war taught me a lot of things, Evelyn, most of them ugly. But one thing I learned is that dying alone is harder than dying surrounded by people who care. I saw men go both ways, and there's a difference. I have Lucy. Lucy's 8 years old and carrying more weight than any child should. She needs someone to help carry it with her." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion she was fighting to control. "What are you saying, Caleb?" "I'm saying if the offer still stands, I'll stay. I'll marry you if that's what helps Lucy sleep at night. I'll fix your fence posts and split your firewood and sit with you when the pain gets bad. And when the end comes, I'll make sure you're not alone." "Why?" The word came out broken. "Why would you do this?" Caleb looked out at the mountains, at the aspens turning gold in the autumn sun, at Lucy carefully gathering eggs in the old coop. "Because 2 years ago I stopped believing I was good for anything except surviving, And maybe this is a chance to find out if there's anything else left in me besides scars and silence. Evelyn pressed her hand to her mouth, and tears slipped down her cheeks despite her obvious effort to hold them back. I don't want you to do this out of guilt. I'm not. I'm doing it because it's the first thing in 2 years that's felt like it might matter. She turned to him then, searching his face with an intensity that felt like she was looking straight into his soul. Whatever she found there must have satisfied something, because she nodded slowly. All right. But we do this honest, Caleb. No pretending this is more than what it is. No false declarations of love or romantic nonsense. We're two practical people making a practical arrangement to help a little girl through the worst thing she'll ever face. Agreed. And you don't owe me anything beyond basic kindness. You're not responsible for saving me or fixing me or making my last days meaningful. You're just here. Is that understood? Understood. Good. Evelyn wiped her eyes with the corner of her shawl. Now, the practical matters. There's a circuit preacher who comes through once a month. He was here 2 weeks ago, so he won't be back for another 2 weeks. If you're willing to wait that long, we can do this properly. 2 weeks is fine. In the meantime, you should stay in the cabin. There's room in the loft, and it's foolish for you to camp outside when winter's coming. She held up a hand before he could protest. I won't have gossip following Lucy after I'm gone. If we're doing this, we do it right. You stay here, you work on the property, and we tell anyone who asks that you're courting me with an eye toward marriage. Caleb smiled despite the circumstances. You've got this all figured out. I've had a lot of time to think about worst-case scenarios. This one's actually better than most. She stood carefully, and Caleb automatically offered his arm for support. She took it without comment, and they walked together toward the chicken coop where Lucy was emerging with a basket of eggs. The girl's face lit up when she saw them walking arm in arm. Mr. Hart's staying. For a while, Evelyn confirmed. He's going to help with repairs and such. And Lucy, we're going to ask Reverend Matthews to perform a ceremony when he comes through next. Lucy set down the egg basket and threw her arms around Caleb's waist with such force it nearly knocked him back a step. He stood frozen for a moment, unused to being touched with affection, then carefully placed one hand on top of her head. Thank you, she whispered against his shirt. Thank you for choosing us. Caleb looked over her head at Evelyn and saw his own uncertainty reflected in her eyes. They were both stepping off a cliff into unknown territory, trusting that somehow they'd figure out how to make this work before they hit bottom. Come on, Evelyn said, gently extracting Lucy from Caleb's waist. Let's get breakfast started. Mr. Hart, Caleb, has a lot of work ahead of him if he's going to make this place presentable before winter. They moved into the cabin together, and Caleb found himself part of something he hadn't experienced in years, the simple domestic rhythm of a family preparing a morning meal. Lucy set the table. Evelyn mixed batter for flapjacks despite the obvious pain it caused her. Caleb fed the fire and hauled water from the creek. It wasn't comfortable exactly. They were still strangers learning each other's rhythms. But there was something settling about it, like a bone sliding back into place after being dislocated for too long. Over breakfast, flapjacks with honey, eggs fried in bacon grease, coffee strong enough to strip paint, they discussed practical matters. Where Caleb would sleep, what repairs took priority, how to explain his presence to the few neighbors scattered across the territory. There's the Johnsons about 3 miles east, Evelyn explained. Good people. They'll help if we need it, but they have their own troubles. Tom broke his leg last spring and it didn't set right. The Andersons are north maybe 5 miles, Lucy added, but Mrs. Anderson doesn't like us much. Lucy, Evelyn warned, it's true, Mama. She thinks we put on airs because you taught me French. Evelyn sighed. Some people are threatened by learning. It's not personal. Feels personal when she won't let Sarah play with me anymore. Caleb listened to this exchange and began to understand just how isolated Evelyn and Lucy had become. Not just because of the illness, but because Evelyn was different, educated, mixed heritage, abandoned by her husband. All reasons for frontier society to keep its distance. What about town? He asked. How far's the nearest settlement? Teller Springs, about 8 miles south, Evelyn said. It's not much. A general store, a saloon, the assayer's office since there's still some mining in the hills. The doctor who told me about the tumor has an office there, though he can't do anything more for me now. We'll need supplies before winter, Caleb said. I can ride down next week, see what needs buying. There's the money I mentioned, Evelyn began, but Caleb shook his head. That money's for Lucy and for after. I've got enough for supplies. It wasn't entirely true. His funds were lower than he'd like, but he'd figure something out. He always did. After breakfast, Caleb began work on the chicken coop roof while Lucy helped her mother with household tasks. He was aware of them moving through the cabin, aware of Evelyn's periodic need to sit and rest, aware of Lucy's constant vigilance over her mother's well-being. The work was good, physical labor that required attention but not deep thought. He pulled rotted shingles free and cut new ones from cedar he found in the woodpile, work his hands remembered even if his mind wanted to wander. Around midday, Lucy brought him lunch, bread and cheese and an apple that had seen better days but still tasted sweet. She sat on an upturned bucket while he ate, swinging her legs and asking questions about where he'd been and what he'd seen. Caleb found himself telling her about riding through the Utah territory, about red rock formations that looked like castles and skies so big they made a man feel small. He edited out the harder parts, the places where desperation and violence lived too close together, the towns where former soldiers drank themselves to death slowly, the graveyards full of people who'd come west looking for fresh starts and found only fresh ways to die. Do you miss it? Lucy asked. Being able to just ride wherever you want? Caleb thought about it honestly. Sometimes, but mostly I was just tired. Tired of moving, tired of not mattering, tired of waking up not knowing where I was or why I was there. And now? Now I know where I am. That's something. Lucy smiled, a real child smile, uncomplicated by the weight she usually carried. I'm glad you're here, Mr. Hart, even if it's scary. Scared of me? No. Scared of hoping. She said it matter-of-factly, like she was commenting on the weather. Hope hurts worse than anything when it breaks, but Mama says sometimes we have to risk it anyway. Caleb reached out and gently tugged her braid. Your mama's a smart woman. The smartest, Lucy agreed. Then, shyly, will you really marry her? For real, I mean, not just pretend? As real as the preacher can make it, Caleb confirmed. Which means you'll need to start calling me Caleb instead of Mr. Hart, or whatever feels right to you. Lucy considered this seriously. Can I think about it? Take all the time you need. She hopped off the bucket and headed back toward the cabin, then paused and turned back. Caleb? Yeah? Thank you for not lying to me, for treating me like I can handle the truth. You've been handling truth harder than most adults could manage. Figured you deserved honesty in return. She nodded and disappeared into the cabin, leaving Caleb alone with his work and his thoughts, and the slow-growing realization that he'd just committed himself to the hardest thing he'd done since the war ended. But for the first time in 2 years, hard didn't feel like the same thing as impossible. The afternoon stretched long and quiet, broken only by the rhythmic sound of Caleb's hammer against wood and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. He finished the chicken coop roof by late afternoon, then moved on to splitting firewood until his shoulders burned and sweat soaked through his shirt despite the autumn chill. Physical exhaustion felt good, clean and simple, a problem with a visible solution. When twilight began painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Evelyn called him in for supper. The cabin smelled of cornbread and beans, and Lucy had set the table with the same careful attention to detail she'd shown the night before. But tonight felt different somehow. Less like strangers sharing a meal and more like the tentative beginning of something that might, against all odds, resemble a household. You've been working hard, Evelyn observed as Caleb washed up at the basin near the door. The coop looks sturdy enough to last through winter now. Still need to do the fence posts and chinking, Caleb said, drying his hands on the towel Lucy handed him. And that woodpile needs to be at least twice as big before the first snow. You don't have to do everything at once. Winter doesn't wait for us to be ready. He sat down at what was rapidly becoming his usual chair, the one closest to the door. Old habit from the war. Always know where the exit is. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the kind that didn't need filling with empty conversation. Caleb noticed how little Evelyn ate, how she pushed food around her plate and took careful, measured bites as if eating required conscious strategy. Lucy noticed, too, her eyes tracking her mother's every movement with the vigilance of someone who'd learned to read pain in another person's face. "Mama," Lucy said eventually, "tell Caleb about the stars." Evelyn looked up, surprise flickering across her features. "Lucy, I'm sure he's not interested in—" "Actually, I am," Caleb interrupted. "Lucy mentioned you know the constellations in Latin. I only know the English names, and half of those I probably get wrong." A faint color rose in Evelyn's cheeks, and Caleb realized she wasn't used to people being genuinely interested in what she knew. Her husband had probably dismissed her learning as impractical. Her neighbors likely found it threatening. "My father believed education was wasted on no one," Evelyn said quietly. "He taught me Latin and Greek alongside the trading languages we needed for business. He said the old names for things connected us to everyone who'd ever looked at the sky and wondered." "That's beautiful." "Most people think it's pretentious." She said it without bitterness, just stating fact. "Most people are wrong about a lot of things." Caleb pushed his empty plate aside. "I'd like to hear about the stars, if you're willing to share." So Evelyn talked, her voice growing stronger as she described the constellations her father had taught her. Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, Cassiopeia and Andromeda, Orion the Hunter with his belt of 3 bright stars. She explained how sailors navigated by Polaris, how different cultures saw different stories in the same patterns of light, how the stars she'd memorized as a child were the same stars ancient Romans had named thousands of years ago. Lucy listened with rapt attention despite having heard these stories before, and Caleb found himself drawn in as well, not just by the information, but by watching Evelyn transform as she spoke. The pain lines around her mouth softened, her eyes lit with genuine enthusiasm. For a few minutes, she wasn't a dying woman, but a teacher sharing something she loved, and Caleb glimpsed the person she must have been before illness stole her future. "My father used to say the stars were proof that some things endure," Evelyn finished, her voice growing softer. "That empires rise and fall, people live and die, but the stars keep burning. He found that comforting." "Do you?" Caleb asked. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "I did once. Now I'm not sure if it's comforting or just lonely, to think of all that light continuing on while we disappear." "Maybe it's both," Lucy offered, "comforting and lonely at the same time." "When did you get so wise?" Evelyn reached over and smoothed her daughter's hair with infinite gentleness. "I learned from you, Mama." The simple statement hung in the air between them, and Caleb saw Evelyn's eyes fill with tears. She blinked away quickly. He understood suddenly that this was what she feared most, not dying itself, but leaving Lucy with only memories. Not being there to guide her daughter through all the years ahead, all the moments of confusion and joy and heartbreak that Evelyn would miss. After supper, Caleb excused himself to bring his things up from the creek camp. It didn't amount to much. A bedroll, saddlebags with a change of clothes and personal effects, his rifle, and the small toolkit he'd accumulated during 2 years of drifting. Everything he owned fit into 2 trips, which said something about the kind of life he'd been living. Lucy showed him the loft space where he'd sleep, a narrow area partitioned from Evelyn's sleeping quarters by a curtain hung on a rope. Someone had already swept the floor and laid out extra blankets, and there was a crate beside the pallet that would serve as a table. "Mama wanted to make sure you were comfortable," Lucy explained. "She put her good blankets out, but I told her you probably had your own." "These are fine," Caleb said, looking at the worn quilts that represented more hospitality than he deserved. "Better than fine. There's a hook for your rifle there on the beam, and you can put your other things in that trunk if you want. It was Papa's, but Mama says it's yours now if you need it." Caleb ran his hand over the trunk's surface, feeling the smooth wood worn by use. Claiming space in another man's abandoned trunk felt strange, but he supposed that was what he was doing, stepping into spaces left vacant by a man who'd failed the women depending on him. "Lucy," he said carefully, "how do you feel about me being here? Really feel, not just the polite answer." She sat down on the top step of the ladder, considering the question with her characteristic seriousness. "Scared," she admitted, "because what if you leave too? What if I let myself believe you'll stay and then one morning you're just gone?" "That's fair. But also hopeful, which is worse somehow, because hope means I might get hurt again." She picked at a loose thread on her dress. "And I'm angry, which I know I'm not supposed to be. Angry at Papa for leaving, angry at Mama for getting sick, angry at everything being so hard all the time. Caleb sat down on the loft floor so they were closer to eye level. Lucy, you're allowed to be angry. Being angry doesn't make you bad. It makes you human. Mama says a lady controls her emotions. Your mama's trying to teach you to survive in a world that's hard on women who show too much feeling. But that doesn't mean the feelings aren't there. They're just hidden. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I'm angry too, if it helps. Angry at your father for being a coward. Angry at whatever sickness is taking your mother. Angry that an 8-year-old girl has to carry this kind of weight. Does the anger help? Not really, but admitting it does, sometimes. Lucy nodded slowly, processing this. Caleb, will you tell me if you're thinking about leaving? Not just disappear, but actually tell me. I promise. And Lucy, I need you to understand something. I'm going to mess this up. I'm going to say the wrong thing or not know what to do or handle situations badly. I'm not a father and I've never been a husband and I'm making this up as I go along. But I give you my word I'll try, and I'll be honest with you about what I can and can't do. That's all I'm asking for. She stood and started down the ladder, then paused. Thank you for not pretending to be perfect. That would be worse somehow. After she'd gone, Caleb arranged his few belongings and lay back on the pallet, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling beams above him. He could hear the soft murmur of Evelyn and Lucy talking below. Couldn't make out words, but could hear the cadence of mother and daughter settling into their evening routine. He thought about the promise he'd made, about staying until the end. 2 months at most, probably less. In the scope of a lifetime, it wasn't much time, but Caleb was starting to understand that duration mattered less than intention, that choosing to be present for someone's final weeks counted for something even if it couldn't change the outcome. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, his dreams were full of things he couldn't save. The next week fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and increasingly natural. Caleb woke before dawn and spent mornings working on repairs while Evelyn and Lucy handled household tasks. The fence posts went in straight and solid, the woodpile grew steadily higher, and he began the tedious work of rechinking the cabin's exterior. Midday, they'd break for lunch, and Caleb found himself drawn into conversations that ranged from practical matters to deeper territory. Evelyn told him about growing up at the trading post, about her Ute mother teaching her which plants healed and which killed, about her French father reading Victor Hugo aloud by lamplight. She spoke of her brief teaching career before marriage, of students eager to learn despite having few resources. I thought I'd open a school one day, she said once while they sat on the porch watching Lucy chase butterflies in the yard. A real school where girls could learn mathematics and literature alongside domestic skills, where being educated wouldn't make them unmarriageable. Why didn't you? I met Henry Hale. She said her late husband's name without inflection, as if he were simply another fact to be recorded. He was handsome and charming and promised me the world, said we'd build an empire together out here in the territory, and I believed him because I was 22 and tired of being different everywhere I went. What happened? Turns out empire building requires work, and Henry was better at talking than doing. We struggled from the start. Bad investments, worse luck, and a husband who preferred whiskey to responsibility. She pulled her shawl tighter against the afternoon breeze. When Lucy came, I thought it might change him, give him purpose. Instead, it just gave him one more thing to resent. He resented his own daughter? He resented that she looked at him with expectations he couldn't meet, that she needed things he couldn't provide. Some men rise to fatherhood. Others run from it. Evelyn's voice remained steady, but Caleb heard the old hurt underneath. When the doctor confirmed the tumor, Henry saw his escape route. He could leave with people thinking he was too grief-stricken to watch me die rather than too cowardly to stay. That's a hell of a thing to do to your family. Yes. Simple agreement, no embellishment needed. They watched Lucy in the yard, spinning in circles with her arms outstretched, trying to make herself dizzy enough to stumble. Such a small moment of childhood joy in the midst of so much sorrow. She deserves better than this, Evelyn said quietly. Better than a dying mother and an absent father and a stranger taking pity on us. I'm not here out of pity. Then why are you here, Caleb? Really? She turned to look at him directly, her sage green eyes searching his face. Lucy asked you an impossible question, and you said yes. Men don't do that without reason. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, watching the mountains in the distance where early snow had already dusted the highest peaks. You asked me once if I was a good man. I told you I didn't know. The truth is, I spent the war doing things I'm not proud of, following orders mostly, but that doesn't make them clean. And after, I just drifted. Couldn't figure out how to be a person again when all I knew was how to be a soldier. That doesn't answer my question. I'm here because staying is hard, and I'm tired of only doing easy things. He met her eyes. I'm here because your daughter asked me to help her carry something too heavy for one person, and I finally had the sense to say yes. And I'm here because maybe, if I do this right, I can prove to myself that the war didn't hollow me out completely. Evelyn reached over and took his hand, the gesture simple and unexpected. Her fingers were cold despite the sun, and he could feel how fragile the bones were beneath thin skin. Thank you for telling me the truth, she said. I can work with truth. It's false comfort and empty promises that I can't stomach. They sat like that for a while, hands clasped while Lucy played in the yard and the aspens whispered overhead. It wasn't romantic. Caleb didn't feel the flutter of new love or the heat of attraction. But it was real, this quiet acknowledgement of two damaged people choosing to face hard things together, and in its own way, that mattered more. The following Sunday, Tom Johnson rode over with his wife Martha to check on Evelyn and meet the stranger who'd apparently taken up residence. Tom's bad leg made him stiff in the saddle, but he had kind eyes and a firm handshake. Martha was a practical woman who assessed Caleb with the same critical eye she'd used to judge livestock, but whatever she saw must have passed muster because she nodded approval. Good you have help with winter coming, Martha said to Evelyn while Tom and Caleb discussed fence repair on the porch. We were worried after Henry left. A woman alone with a child, that's difficult even without illness. Caleb's been a blessing, Evelyn said, and the ease with which she said his name suggested she'd been practicing. Wedding soon, then? Martha's directness would have been rude in a city parlor, but here on the frontier where time and energy were precious commodities, it was simply efficient. When Reverend Matthews comes through. 2 weeks, if he keeps his schedule. We'll bring a ham, Martha decided. And Tom can play fiddle for dancing, bad leg or not. No sense in not celebrating just because circumstances are unusual. After the Johnsons left, Evelyn seemed brighter somehow, as if their approval had lifted some burden she'd been carrying. Martha can be abrupt, she said while Lucy helped her prepare supper. But she's genuine. When she says she'll bring a ham, she means it. More than we deserve for pulling them into this, Caleb said. They're not being pulled into anything. Frontier folk understand that sometimes survival means borrowing strength from each other. They do the same and expect us to help in return. That evening, after Lucy had gone to bed, Evelyn asked Caleb to sit with her on the porch while she took her medicine. The laudanum was running low, barely enough for another week, and each dose had to be measured carefully. Caleb watched her calculate the drops with steady hands, despite the pain that had her breathing shallow. Will you read to me? She asked, after she'd swallowed the bitter liquid. There's a book of poetry on the shelf, the one with the brown cover. I'd do it myself, but the words swim sometimes after the medicine. Caleb retrieved the book and found it was a collection of American poets, the pages soft from repeated reading. He'd never been much for poetry. Words had always seemed inadequate compared to action during the war, but he opened to a marked page and began to read. His voice was rough and unpracticed, stumbling over meter he didn't understand, but Evelyn listened with her eyes closed and something like peace on her face. When he finished the poem about a ship setting sail toward sunset, she was quiet for a long time. My mother used to say that death is just a different kind of journey, she said eventually. That we're all sailing toward the same horizon, we just can't see what's on the other side. Do you believe that? I want to. I want to believe there's something beyond this, that I'll see my parents again, that death isn't just nothing. She opened her eyes and looked at him. But mostly I'm afraid. Not of pain, I've made my peace with that, but afraid that Lucy will forget me, that in 5 years or 10 she'll barely remember my face. She won't forget, Caleb said firmly. You're written into her bones, Evelyn, the way she thinks, the way she speaks. The way she faces hard things with her chin up, that's all you. She'll carry you with her long after your body gives out. Tears slipped down Evelyn's cheeks, and this time she didn't try to hide them. I need her to know she was loved, that every hard choice I made, every sacrifice, was because she mattered more than anything. Can you tell her that? After. I'll tell her every day if that's what she needs. And will you love her, Caleb? Not right away. I know that's not fair to ask, but eventually, can you see yourself loving my daughter like she's your own? It was the first time she'd asked him for something beyond the bare minimum of staying through the end. Caleb thought about Lucy's ancient eyes and brave questions, about the way she carried impossible weight without complaint, about her careful grammar and her anger she tried to hide, and her desperate hope that hurt more than despair. Yeah, he said quietly. I think I already do a little bit. Not the way you do, maybe never that way, but enough that I'll spend the rest of my life making sure she knows she matters. Evelyn reached for his hand again, holding it between both of hers. Then we're doing the right thing. However strange it looks from the outside, we're doing something right. The next week passed in similar fashion, work and meals and quiet conversations that slowly built something that resembled trust. Caleb rode into Teller Springs for supplies and endured the curious stares and pointed questions about the widow Hale and her new man. He kept his answers simple and his face neutral, understanding that frontier gossip spread faster than wildfire but burned out just as quick if you didn't feed it. He brought back flour and sugar, coffee and dried beans, and spent the last of his money on more laudanum from the doctor, who looked at him with poorly concealed pity. The doctor wanted to know if Mrs. Hale was managing her pain, how much the swelling had increased, whether she was still able to eat solid food. Caleb answered what he could and promised to bring Evelyn to town if she wanted to see the doctor one last time. There's nothing more I can do medically, the doctor said bluntly, but sometimes patients find comfort in saying goodbye, in putting their affairs in order. She's already doing that, Caleb replied, and the doctor nodded as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. The day before Reverend Matthews was due to arrive, Evelyn asked Lucy to help her wash and pin up her hair. She wanted to look her best for the wedding, she said, even though it wasn't a real wedding in the traditional sense. Lucy worked carefully, braiding her mother's hair into a coronet that made her look regal despite her illness. You're beautiful, Mama, Lucy said, and meant it. I'm a shadow of what I was, Evelyn corrected gently, but thank you for seeing me with loving eyes. That night, Caleb sat up late by the fire, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. Tomorrow he would marry a woman he barely knew, promising to love and honor someone who had maybe 6 weeks left to live. It was absurd and impossible, and nothing about it made conventional sense. But he'd learned during the war that conventional sense was overrated, that sometimes the right thing looked nothing like you expected it to. That courage often wore strange faces and came from unlikely sources. He heard soft footsteps on the ladder and turned to find Evelyn descending carefully, wrapped in a blanket against the night chill. She settled into the rocking chair near the fire, and for a while they sat in silence watching flames dance in the hearth. Having second thoughts? She asked eventually. No, you? Every minute. She smiled slightly. But I'm going through with it anyway. For Lucy. And maybe a little bit for me, too. Why for you? Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, rocking slowly. Because I want to believe, even for a little while, that someone chose me. Not because they had to, not because society demanded it, but because they looked at all my brokenness and decided I was still worth staying for. Evelyn, I know it's not real love, Caleb. I'm not naive enough to believe otherwise. But it's real choice, and right now that's more valuable than romance. She looked at him directly. Tomorrow when that preacher asks if I take you to be my husband, I'm going to say yes. And I'm going to mean it, even though I'm dying. Even though this whole situation is impossible. Because you gave me something I thought I'd lost. Proof that I'm more than my failures. Caleb moved from his chair to kneel beside the rocker, taking both her hands in his. You listen to me. You are not your failures. You're a woman who taught her daughter to read by lamplight and name stars in Latin. You're someone who keeps fighting even when your body betrays you. You're a mother who loves her child enough to ask impossible things from strangers. That's not failure, Evelyn. That's strength I can barely imagine. She cupped his face with one trembling hand, her palm cool against his bearded cheek. How did Lucy know? How did she look at you and see exactly what we needed? Maybe she's wiser than both of us. Children often are. Evelyn let her hand fall back to her lap. Tomorrow, when it's official, I need you to promise me something. All right? Don't grieve me more than necessary. I don't want Lucy learning that love means endless sorrow. Mourn what needs mourning, but then live, Caleb. Live the life I won't get to finish. Show my daughter that death is sad, but not the end of everything. That's a hard promise. All the important ones are. They sat together until the fire burned low, and Evelyn's medicine pulled her toward sleep. Caleb helped her back up the ladder, steadying her when she swayed and retreated to his own pallet where he finally found rest. Morning broke clear and cold, frost glittering on the grass like scattered diamonds. Caleb woke to the smell of coffee brewing and found Lucy already dressed in what must have been her best dress. Faded blue calico with white flowers. The hem let down so many times the fabric showed different shades where sun hadn't reached. She'd braided her hair carefully and tied it with a ribbon that matched the dress. Reverend Matthews arrived early, she said when Caleb climbed down from the loft. He's watering his horse at the creek. Mama's getting ready. Caleb poured himself coffee with hands that weren't quite steady. He'd faced Confederate cavalry without his pulse jumping like this, but the thought of speaking vows in front of a preacher made his throat tight. You look scared, Lucy observed. I am scared. Good. Mama says if you're not scared, you're not paying attention. She handed him a piece of cornbread. Eat something. You're too thin and it makes you look haunted. Despite everything, Caleb smiled. When did you become the one taking care of everyone? The day Papa left and didn't come back. She said it without self-pity, just stating fact. Someone had to. Well, you don't have to anymore, not alone anyway. He ate the cornbread in 3 bites, not tasting it. How's your mama this morning? She took extra time with her hair, and she's wearing the blue dress, the one Papa bought her when they first married. It still fits if she cinches the waist. Lucy's voice dropped. She wants to look pretty for you. She doesn't need to do that for me. I know, but she wants to anyway. Let her have this, Caleb. Let her feel like a bride instead of just a dying woman. The wisdom in those words, coming from an 8-year-old, struck him silent. He nodded and finished his coffee while Lucy set out plates for breakfast. Through the window he could see Reverend Matthews leading his horse back from the creek, a tall man with silver hair and a face that had seen enough frontier hardship to have earned its lines. The Reverend knocked, despite the door standing open, and Caleb called for him to enter. He came in with his Bible under one arm and his coat dusty from travel, his eyes taking in the sparse cabin and settling on Caleb with practiced assessment. Mr. Hart, I presume? Tom Johnson mentioned you'd taken up residence here. Yes, sir. Caleb shook the offered hand. Thank you for coming. Mrs. Hale sent word she wished to marry, and I make it my business to honor such requests when I can. The Reverend set his Bible on the table. Though I confess I'm curious about the circumstances. You've only been here a few weeks, by my understanding. Yes, sir. And you understand Mrs. Hale's condition? I do. Reverend Matthews studied him for a long moment. Some might say marrying a dying woman is either very noble or very foolish. Which do you think it is, Mr. Hart? Caleb met his eyes without flinching. I think it's necessary, and I think your opinion of it matters less than what it means to the woman upstairs and her daughter. A smile ghosted across the Reverend's face. Fair enough. I've learned not to judge frontier marriages too harshly. People do what they must to survive, and if that means unconventional vows, so be it. He turned to Lucy. And how do you feel about this marriage, Miss Lucy? I asked him to marry her, Lucy said clearly. So if anyone should be judged, Reverend, it should be me. Child, I'm not here to judge anyone. I'm here to witness a covenant between 2 people before their community and their conscience. If Mr. Hart and your mother both consent freely, then I'll speak the words gladly. The sound of careful footsteps on the ladder made them all turn. Evelyn descended slowly, one hand gripping the ladder for support, and when she reached the bottom and turned to face them, Caleb's breath caught. She'd transformed herself through sheer will and careful grooming into something that transcended her illness. The blue dress hung loose at her waist, but the color brought out her eyes and made her skin seem less pale. She'd pinned her hair up in that coronet braid Lucy had woven, with small white flowers from the last of the autumn asters tucked into it. Someone had found rouge to bring color to her cheeks, and her hands were steady as she smoothed her skirt. "Evelyn," Caleb said, and couldn't find words beyond her name. "I know I'm not much to look at anymore," she began, but he crossed the room in 3 strides and took her hands. "You're beautiful. Don't say otherwise." Tears gathered in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "You're kind to lie." "I'm not lying. You're the strongest, most beautiful woman I've ever met, and I'm honored to stand beside you today." Reverend Matthews cleared his throat gently. "Shall we proceed? I believe the Johnsons will be arriving shortly. Tom mentioned they wanted to witness the ceremony." As if summoned by the mention, the sound of wagon wheels crunched outside. Tom and Martha Johnson climbed down, Martha carrying a cloth-covered basket that presumably held the promised ham. Behind them came 2 more wagons, the Andersons from the north and a family Caleb hadn't met yet, the Parkers, who ran a small mining claim in the hills. "Didn't think you'd want to do this without witnesses," Martha said, bustling into the cabin with the easy authority of a woman used to organizing frontier gatherings. "A wedding's a wedding, circumstances be damned, and it deserves proper celebrating." Evelyn pressed her hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. "Martha, you didn't have to—" "Hush now. We take care of our own out here, and you're one of ours whether that witch Eleanor Anderson likes it or not." Martha shot a pointed look at the other woman, who had the grace to look uncomfortable. Eleanor Anderson was a pinched woman who'd clearly come out of obligation rather than affection, but her husband Daniel seemed kind enough. He shook Caleb's hand and said, "Glad Evelyn's got someone to help with the place. Winter's coming hard by the feel of it." The Parkers, a young couple named Samuel and Ruth with a baby on Ruth's hip, crowded in last, and suddenly the small cabin felt full of life and noise and the complicated warmth of community that Caleb had almost forgotten existed. Reverend Matthews positioned Caleb and Evelyn in front of the hearth, while the others arranged themselves as witnesses. Lucy stood beside her mother, one small hand clutching Evelyn's dress, as if to anchor her to earth a while longer. Someone had brought wildflowers that Ruth arranged in a jar on the mantel, and Tom produced his fiddle, though he'd wait until after the vows to play. The Reverend opened his Bible and cleared his throat, and the cabin fell quiet. "We are gathered here in the sight of this community to join Caleb Hart and Evelyn Rose Hale in matrimony," he began, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 such ceremonies spoken in rough cabins and windswept plains. "Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but with clear understanding of the commitment being made. Caleb, Evelyn, you come to this moment under circumstances that are not ordinary, but the vows you speak here are no less binding for their unusual nature." He paused, looking at them both. In frontier life, we learn that marriage takes many forms. Sometimes it's about partnership in building a homestead. Sometimes it's about survival through hard winters. Sometimes it's about creating family where blood ties don't exist. Whatever form it takes, the essential truth remains. 2 people choosing to face life together, to bear each other's burdens, to offer comfort in sorrow, and companionship in joy. Caleb felt the weight of those words settle over him like a physical thing. This wasn't the romantic wedding he'd vaguely imagined as a young man before the war. There would be no long future of building a life together, no children born of their union, no growing old side by side. But the commitment was real nonetheless, and he felt it in his bones. "Caleb Hart," Reverend Matthews said, turning to him, "do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do you part?" Caleb looked at Evelyn, at the hope and fear warring in her eyes, at the way she held herself upright through obvious pain, at the quiet dignity she wore like armor. "I do." "Evelyn Rose Hale, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do you part?" Evelyn's voice when she spoke was clear and steady. "I do." "Have you rings to exchange?" Caleb had thought about this, had worried over it during the long nights. He had no ring to give, nothing of value to mark this moment, but Evelyn surprised him by producing a simple gold band from her pocket. "It was my mother's," she said quietly. "She would have wanted it used this way." Caleb took the ring with reverent care and slipped it onto Evelyn's finger. It was too large, spinning loose on her thinned hand, but she curled her fingers to keep it in place. "I don't have anything to give you," she whispered, distress crossing her face. "You've given me more than you know," Caleb replied, and meant it. Reverend Matthews smiled. "Then by the authority vested in me by the territory of Colorado, and in the presence of these witnesses, I pronounce you husband and wife. Caleb, you may kiss your bride." Caleb leaned down carefully, aware of Evelyn's fragility, and pressed his lips gently to hers. It was chaste and brief, but he felt her hand come up to rest against his chest, felt her lean into him for just a moment as if drawing strength from his solidity. When they parted, her eyes were bright with tears. The cabin erupted in applause and well wishes. Tom struck up a lively tune on his fiddle, and Martha was already organizing people to set out the food they'd brought. The ham appeared, along with fresh bread and preserves, dried fruit, and a jug of cider that Daniel Anderson admitted he'd been saving for a special occasion. "Didn't think I'd be using it for this," he said, shooting his wife a look that suggested they'd argued about coming. But Evelyn deserved celebration as much as anyone. The cabin that had felt sparse and lonely for so long filled with music and laughter and the sound of people who'd chosen to show up for one of their own. Evelyn was helped to the rocking chair where she could watch without exhausting herself, and Lucy stayed close by her side, glowing with something that looked like relief. Caleb found himself pulled into conversations with men he barely knew, accepting congratulations that felt both genuine and sad, answering questions about his plans for the property with answers that carefully skirted the reality that these plans would be enacted alone sooner rather than later. "You'll want to get trapping lines set before the snow flies," Samuel Parker advised. "Beaver and marten both run thick in the creek valleys. Could make decent money come spring if you work it right." "I'll keep that in mind. And if you need help with anything, you send Lucy to fetch me," Tom Johnson added. "Bad leg or not, I can still swing a hammer or hold a saw steady. That's what neighbors are for." The generosity of it, the simple willingness of these hardscrabble people to offer help they could barely afford to give, moved Caleb in ways he hadn't expected. He'd spent 2 years among strangers who looked through him like he wasn't there. Here, in this rough cabin with these rough people, he was being welcomed as one of them. Martha cornered him eventually, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "She doesn't have long, does she?" Caleb saw no point in lying. "No, ma'am. Weeks, maybe less." "And after? You'll look after Lucy?" "That's my intention." Martha nodded, satisfied. "Good. That child deserves stability, and Evelyn deserves to go knowing her daughter's cared for." She glanced over at where Evelyn sat surrounded by the other women, all of them careful not to tire her but determined to include her in the celebration. She was always too good for Henry Hale. Man couldn't see what he had until it was walking out the door. His loss. "Indeed." Martha patted Caleb's arm. "You're doing a good thing here, whatever anyone says about it. Sometimes the right thing looks strange from the outside." The afternoon wore on, full of food and music and storytelling. Tom played while Samuel sang in a surprisingly good tenor, and Ruth danced with her baby in her arms, spinning until the child laughed. Even Eleanor Anderson thawed slightly after her second cup of cider, admitting that she'd been wrong to judge Evelyn harshly for her mixed heritage. "Fear makes fools of us all," she said, not quite an apology, but close enough. "I hope you'll forgive my coldness." Evelyn, gracious even in her exhaustion, simply said, "There's nothing to forgive. We're all just trying to survive out here as best we can." As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, the guests prepared to leave. Martha packed up the leftover food, insisting Caleb and Evelyn keep it. Tom tucked his fiddle back in its case and promised to return in a few weeks to check on them. The Parkers and Andersons offered similar promises of support, and even Eleanor managed a stiff but sincere wish for Evelyn's comfort. When the last wagon had rolled away and silence settled over the cabin again, Caleb found himself standing in the doorway watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of crimson and gold. Behind him he could hear Lucy helping Evelyn to bed, the soft murmur of their voices intimate and tender. He was married now, husband to a dying woman, Stepfather to a grieving child, caretaker of a property he'd never wanted, and a future he couldn't quite envision. Everything about it defied logic and challenged every instinct for self-preservation he'd developed over the past 2 years. But as he stood there watching the light fade from the sky, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt since before the war. Purpose. Not the purpose of following orders or surviving the next battle, but the deeper purpose of mattering to someone. Of being necessary not because he could fight or shoot straight, but because he'd chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier. "Caleb?" Lucy's voice came from behind him. "Mama wants to talk to you." He found Evelyn propped up in her bed in the loft, the quilts pulled up around her shoulders. She looked exhausted but peaceful, the laudanum she'd taken easing the worst of her pain. The ring on her finger caught lamplight, spinning loose but staying on through determination alone. "Sit with me?" she asked, patting the edge of the bed. Caleb sat carefully, aware of her fragility. "It was a good day." "It was." Evelyn smiled, the expression transforming her drawn face into something that echoed the woman she'd been before illness claimed her. "Better than I deserved. Better than I dared hope for. You deserved every bit of it and more." She reached for his hand, threading her thin fingers through his. "I need to thank you, Caleb. Not just for today, but for giving me something I thought I'd lost. You gave me back my dignity. Let me die as a wife instead of an abandoned woman. That's a gift I can't repay." "You don't owe me anything, Evelyn. We made a deal, remember? Practical arrangement, no debt between us." Except it stopped being just practical somewhere along the way, didn't it? Her eyes searched his face. "At least for me. I think I started caring about you more than I meant to. Started hoping you might stay not just out of obligation, but because you wanted to." Caleb's throat tightened. "Evelyn, don't say anything you don't mean," she interrupted gently. "I know I'm dying and that makes everything complicated, but I want you to know that these past weeks, having you here, it's been good. You made me remember what it felt like to be seen as a person instead of just a problem to be solved. You were never just a problem." "No?" She laughed softly. "What was I then?" Caleb thought about it carefully, wanting to give her truth instead of easy comfort. "You were a woman doing impossible things with grace I couldn't imagine. You were a mother who loved her child enough to ask a stranger for help. You were someone who taught me that staying is sometimes braver than leaving." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "Will you remember me, Caleb, after?" "Every day. And will you tell Lucy about me when she's older? Not just the facts, but the truth of who I was, my mistakes and my dreams and all the complicated, messy parts that make a person real?" "I promise." She squeezed his hand weakly. "Then I can rest easier, knowing she'll have you to fill in the gaps when her memories fade, knowing she won't be alone." They sat together in the lamplight, husband and wife in the strangest sense, connected not by romance but by shared purpose and the kind of intimacy that comes from facing hard truths together. Eventually, Evelyn's grip loosened as the medicine pulled her toward sleep, and Caleb carefully tucked her hand back under the quilts. He descended the ladder to find Lucy curled up in the rocking chair wrapped in a blanket, her eyes wide and wakeful. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Don't want to. Today was too good. I want to remember every part of it." She shifted to make room, and Caleb settled beside her, the chair creaking under their combined weight. They rocked in silence for a while, the fire burning low and casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, hunting. "Caleb?" Lucy's voice was small. "What happens after Mama dies?" He'd been expecting this question, dreading it, but she deserved an honest answer. "We'll bury her somewhere beautiful, with a view of the mountains she loved. We'll have a service and say proper goodbyes, and then we'll figure out how to keep living. Will you stay? Really stay, not just until?" "Really stay. This is home now, Lucy, for both of us." "Even though it's hard?" "Especially because it's hard. The things worth doing usually are." Lucy leaned against his shoulder, and Caleb wrapped his arm around her, holding this child who'd become his daughter through the strangest of circumstances. They sat like that until the fire died to embers, and Lucy's breathing evened out in sleep. Caleb carried her to her bed and tucked her in, then climbed to the loft where his own pallet waited. He could hear Evelyn's soft breathing from behind the curtain, could see the faint glow of lamplight she kept burning low through the night, now that darkness frightened her. He lay down on his pallet and stared at the ceiling beams, thinking about vows spoken and promises made, about a dying woman who'd given him purpose and a child who'd given him hope. Nothing about this situation made conventional sense, but Caleb was learning that sense mattered less than truth, and the truth was he'd found something here worth fighting for. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with clouds promising snow before nightfall. Caleb woke to find Evelyn already downstairs, moving slowly but determined, making coffee with careful concentration. "You should rest," he said, coming to take the coffee pot from her hands. "I've rested enough. This is a good morning, Caleb. I want to use it." She smiled at his concerned expression. "I know my limits. When I need to rest, I'll rest. But right now I want to make coffee for my husband and feel normal for a little while longer." So he let her, hovering nearby in case she needed him, but allowing her the dignity of doing this small task herself. They drank their coffee together while Lucy still slept, and Evelyn talked about the wedding, about how good it had been to see friends she'd feared she'd lost. "Martha was kind to come," she said, "and even Eleanor, though that must have cost her pride to bend like that." "People surprised me yesterday," Caleb admitted. "The way they showed up, no questions asked, just came because they thought you deserved celebrating. Frontier communities are strange that way. We'll judge you for being different, but when crisis comes, we close ranks and take care of our own." She set down her cup, her hands trembling slightly. "Caleb, I need to talk to you about practical matters. About after." "All right. There's money in the trunk in the loft, like I mentioned, about $140. It's not much, but it should cover burial costs and tide you and Lucy over through winter if you're careful. The property deed is there too, in Henry's name still, but Tom Johnson knows a lawyer in Denver who can help transfer it to you as my widower." Caleb started to protest, but Evelyn raised her hand. "Please, let me do this. The property is all I have to give, and I want it in your name so no one can take it from Lucy. She'll need stability, Caleb, a place that's hers, even if it's really yours on paper." "It'll be hers," Caleb said firmly. "Every inch of it. I'm just holding it until she's old enough to decide what to do with it." "You're a good man." Evelyn's voice broke slightly. "Better than you believe you are." They spent the morning together, all three of them, doing ordinary tasks that felt precious because of their impermanence. Lucy helped Evelyn sort through her mother's few possessions, deciding what should be kept for Lucy and what could be let go. Caleb worked on repairs, always within earshot in case he was needed. Around midday, the first snow began to fall, fat, lazy flakes that caught in the aspens and turned the world soft and quiet. Evelyn stood at the window watching it come down, Lucy tucked under one arm and her hand resting on the glass. "I always loved first snow," she said softly. "The way it makes everything clean, covers all the broken, ugly things, and makes them beautiful again." Caleb came to stand behind them, and on impulse, Evelyn reached back and took his hand. They stood there together, husband, wife, and daughter bound by choice rather than blood, watching winter claim the landscape. In that moment, Caleb understood what Evelyn had been trying to tell him all along. This wasn't about saving anyone or being saved. It was about bearing witness to each other's humanity, about choosing connection even when loss was guaranteed. The snow continued through the afternoon, transforming the rough frontier into something that looked almost magical. Lucy pressed her nose to the window glass, her breath fogging it as she traced patterns with her finger. Evelyn grew tired after lunch and allowed Caleb to help her back to bed, her weight so insubstantial in his arms that it frightened him. "Stay with me a while?" she asked as he tucked the quilts around her. Caleb pulled up the small stool that served as a bedside table and sat holding her hand while she drifted in and out of restless sleep. He noticed things he'd been trying not to see, how shallow her breathing had become, how the skin stretched tight over her cheekbones, how even the laudanum couldn't quite mask the pain anymore. When she woke near evening, her eyes were clearer than they'd been in days, as if some decision had been made in the depths of her dreaming. "Caleb, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Always? When I'm gone, will you let yourself be happy again? Will you let yourself have a real life instead of just existing in the shadow of this?" The question caught him off guard. "Evelyn, I don't think—" Please, I need to know that this won't be the thing that breaks you, that you'll keep living, maybe find real love someday, build something lasting. Her grip on his hand tightened with surprising strength. I married you to give Lucy stability, yes, but also because I saw something in you worth saving. A good man who'd forgotten how to be good to himself. Don't let my death cement you in grief, Caleb. That would make everything we've done here meaningless. How can you ask me to think about happiness when you're... He couldn't finish the sentence. Because I'm dying, not dead, and because the best gift you can give me is the promise that my death won't destroy you. She reached up and touched his face, her palm cool against his cheek. Promise me you'll let yourself heal, that you'll be the father Lucy needs, not a ghost haunted by guilt and loss. I promise, Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't control. But Evelyn, you need to know something too. These weeks with you and Lucy, they've already started healing something in me I thought was broken beyond repair. So don't think your life didn't matter. Don't die believing you were just a burden I carried. You gave me something I didn't even know I'd lost. Tears tracked down her temples into her hair. What did I give you? A reason to be better than I was. A home. A family. He pressed his forehead to her hand. Everything that matters. They sat like that until Lucy called up that supper was ready, her young voice trying so hard to sound normal despite the weight pressing down on all of them. Evelyn insisted on coming down to eat with them, though Caleb had to help her navigate the ladder, and she could only manage a few bites of the stew Lucy had made. That night established a pattern that would hold for the next 3 weeks. Evelyn's good days grew fewer and farther between, the bad days stretching longer and darker. The laudanum ran out despite Caleb's careful rationing, and he made a desperate ride through early snow to Teller Springs for more, returning with medicine and the knowledge that the doctor expected to hear news of Evelyn's death any day now. Lucy grew quieter as her mother faded, spending hours reading aloud from the poetry book or singing the French lullabies Evelyn had taught her. Caleb found work to keep his hands busy, cutting firewood until his shoulders screamed, repairing tools that didn't need fixing, anything to avoid sitting idle while death crept closer. The community showed up in small ways. Martha Johnson brought soup and stayed to help with laundry. Tom came to check the livestock and ended up splitting wood alongside Caleb, the two men working in companionable silence that said more than words could. Even Eleanor Anderson surprised them by appearing one morning with fresh bread and an offer to sit with Evelyn so Caleb could rest. I was wrong about a lot of things, Eleanor said quietly, while Caleb stood in the doorway uncertain whether to trust this gesture. Let me try to make some of it right. So he let her sit with Evelyn, and when he returned from checking trap lines, he found the two women talking softly about children and regrets and all the complicated ways women's lives got tangled up in men's choices. 3 weeks after the wedding, a night came when Evelyn couldn't hide her agony anymore. The tumor had grown to the point where even breathing hurt, and the laudanum barely touched the edges of her pain. Caleb sat beside her bed, while Lucy dozed fitfully in the chair, holding Evelyn's hand and feeling utterly helpless. I'm sorry, Evelyn gasped between shallow breaths. I'm sorry you have to see this. That Lucy has to see this. Don't apologize for dying, Evelyn. You're doing the hardest thing any of us ever has to do, and you're doing it with more grace than most. Grace? She laughed, the sound wet and broken. There's no grace in this, Caleb, just suffering that won't end. He wanted to argue, to offer comfort. But what comfort could he give against this kind of pain? Instead, he did the only thing he could. He stayed. He wiped her forehead with cool cloths, helped her sip water when she could manage it, and held her through the worst of the spasms that racked her failing body. Near dawn, Lucy woke and came to the bedside, her face pale and frightened. Mama? Evelyn managed to focus on her daughter, summoning reserves of strength from some deep well Caleb couldn't fathom. Come here, baby girl. Lucy climbed carefully onto the bed, and Evelyn wrapped her arms around her daughter one last time, holding her close despite the pain it must have caused. I need you to listen to me, Evelyn whispered. Can you do that? Yes, Mama. You are the best thing I ever did in this life, the only thing I got completely right. And I need you to promise me you'll remember that you are loved. Not because you earned it or deserve it, but because you exist and that's enough." Her voice was fading, each word requiring visible effort. "Can you promise me that?" "I promise." Lucy was crying now, tears soaking into her mother's nightgown. "And promise me you'll let Caleb take care of you. He's a good man, Lucy, better than he knows. Let him be your father, not because he's replacing anyone, but because everyone needs someone to hold them when the world gets hard." "I promise, Mama. I promise everything." Evelyn looked at Caleb over Lucy's head, and the gratitude in her eyes nearly broke him. "Thank you," she mouthed silently. He nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. The day dragged on with agonizing slowness. Evelyn slipped in and out of consciousness, each wakeful moment more confused than the last. She called for her parents, spoke French to people who weren't there, asked Lucy to fetch books from a library that existed only in memory. Through it all, Caleb and Lucy stayed close, maintaining a vigil that felt both sacred and unbearable. As afternoon faded toward evening, Evelyn seemed to surface one last time into clarity. Her breathing had changed, grown labored and rattling in a way that Caleb recognized from the war. This was the sound bodies made when they were preparing to shut down, when death was hours away instead of days. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He leaned close. "I'm here." "The stars. Can you see them tonight?" He looked toward the window where the first stars were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Yes. Clear night. They're beautiful. Tell me their names, the Latin ones." So Caleb recited what he remembered of the lessons Evelyn had taught him: Ursa Major, Cassiopeia, Orion with his belt of 3 bright stars. He stumbled over the words, got some of them wrong, but Evelyn smiled anyway, her eyes following something he couldn't see. "My father was right," she murmured. "Some things do endure. The stars will keep burning long after we're gone. There's comfort in that, I think, in knowing we're part of something bigger than our small lives." "You're part of something that will endure," Caleb said. "You're part of Lucy. Everything good in her comes from you, Evelyn. That's immortality worth having." She turned her head slightly to look at her daughter, who was curled up beside her with red-rimmed eyes and a grip on her mother's hand that refused to let go. "My beautiful girl," Evelyn breathed. "So brave, so strong. I'm sorry I have to leave you." "Don't be sorry, Mama. Just rest. We'll be okay." "Promise?" "I promise." Evelyn's eyes drifted closed and her breathing grew shallower. Caleb checked her pulse, thready and irregular. He'd seen this before, knew what it meant. Hours, maybe less. He sent Lucy downstairs to make tea, needing to give the girl a task to focus on and wanting a moment alone with his wife. When Lucy's footsteps faded, he leaned close to Evelyn's ear. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I need you to know something. You asked me once why I stayed, and I gave you half-true answers because I didn't fully understand it myself. But I understand now." He pressed his lips to her forehead, feeling how hot and dry her skin had become. "I stayed because you and Lucy reminded me what it means to be human. You gave me back something the war stole, the ability to care about someone more than I care about protecting myself. That's a gift I can never repay." Evelyn didn't respond, but he felt her hand twitch in his, and he chose to believe she'd heard him. Lucy returned with tea that neither of them drank, and together they kept watch as the night deepened and Evelyn's breathing grew increasingly labored. Around midnight, her eyes opened one last time, unfocused and distant, but she seemed to see them both. "Love," she whispered. Just that one word, but it contained everything: gratitude and sorrow and hope and release all tangled together. Then her breathing changed again, became the irregular gasping that Caleb knew meant the end was very close. He pulled Lucy onto his lap, holding her tight while they watched Evelyn struggle for air that wouldn't come, her body fighting a battle it had already lost. Just after 2 a.m, Evelyn Rose's heart took a final shuddering breath and went still. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Lucy's sudden, wrenching sob. Caleb held his daughter, and she was his daughter now in every way that mattered, while she cried for her mother. He held her until his arms ached and his shirt was soaked with her tears, and the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the window. He held her because that's what fathers did, and because holding her was the only thing standing between him and the grief threatening to pull him under. When Lucy finally cried herself out, she pulled back and looked at her mother's still form. She looks peaceful now, like the pain finally stopped. It did, Lucy. She's not hurting anymore. Should we close her eyes? That's what they do in books. Caleb reached over and gently closed Evelyn's eyes, then pulled the quilt up to her chest with reverent care. We'll take care of everything, Lucy. Together. They sat with Evelyn's body for another hour. As the sun rose, neither of them quite ready to begin the business of death. The washing and dressing, the grave digging, the notifications that needed to be sent. For now, they just sat in the presence of what had been and tried to comprehend what would come next. Eventually, practical necessity pulled them back to the living. Caleb sent Lucy to fetch Martha Johnson while he began the grim task of preparing Evelyn's body. Martha arrived with Eleanor Anderson in tow, and the two women took over with the practiced efficiency of frontier wives who'd done this too many times before. You go dig, Martha said firmly, shooing Caleb out of the loft. Yeah. We'll make her presentable. So Caleb took his shovel and walked to the spot Evelyn had pointed out weeks ago, a small rise overlooking the valley, where aspens grew in a circle and the view stretched all the way to the mountains. The ground was half frozen, and digging took hours of backbreaking work, but he welcomed the physical pain as distraction from the emotional anguish. Tom Johnson showed up halfway through and took the shovel from Caleb's hands. Rest, I'll finish this. It's my responsibility. It's what neighbors do. Now rest before you collapse. Caleb sank down on a nearby rock and watched Tom dig while snow began to fall again, gentle and steady. Other neighbors arrived, Daniel Anderson bringing lumber for a coffin, Samuel Parker with his carpentry tools, Ruth with food that nobody would eat but that needed to be prepared anyway. By afternoon, a simple pine coffin stood in the cabin's main room, and Evelyn lay inside dressed in her blue wedding dress, her hands folded over her chest and wildflowers arranged around her. Martha had braided her hair one last time, and someone had found rouge to bring color back to her pale cheeks. Lucy stood beside the coffin for a long time, just looking at her mother, before finally reaching in to place something beside Evelyn's hands, a small book of poetry, the one with the brown cover they'd read from so many times. So she has something familiar, Lucy explained when Caleb looked at her questioningly, in case she gets lonely. The funeral happened the next morning, with Reverend Matthews speaking words about dust and ashes and eternal rest, while a small group of neighbors stood in the falling snow. They lowered the coffin into the frozen ground, and everyone took turns throwing dirt on top until the grave was filled and mounded. Tom fashioned a simple cross from pine, and Lucy insisted on carving her mother's name herself, Evelyn Rose Hart. She included the Hart surname deliberately, claiming her mother's brief marriage as valid and meaningful, despite its unconventional nature. After everyone left, Caleb and Lucy stood at the graveside until the cold drove them back to the cabin. The house felt impossibly empty without Evelyn's presence, even though she'd spent most of the last weeks confined to bed. Her absence was a physical thing, a hole in the fabric of their daily existence. That first week passed in a blur of grief and adjustment. Lucy cried often, but also showed surprising resilience, throwing herself into household tasks as if staying busy could keep the sorrow at bay. Caleb found himself talking to Evelyn sometimes when he was alone, telling her about his day or asking her opinion on decisions he had to make. The neighbors continued showing up with food and offers of help, and slowly Caleb began to understand that he and Lucy weren't alone out here. They'd been folded into a community that would hold them up through the worst of their grief. 2 weeks after Evelyn's death, winter settled in with real ferocity. Snow piled high against the cabin walls, and the temperature dropped so low that water froze in the basin overnight. Caleb spent his days maintaining the fire, checking the animals, and making sure they had enough supplies to last until spring. Lucy asked him one night while they sat by the fire, "Do you regret it? Staying, I mean?" Caleb looked at this child who'd become his whole world in a matter of weeks. Not for a single second. Even though it hurt? Watching Mama die? Even though it hurt. Lucy, some things are worth the pain they cause. Your mother was one of those things, and you're another. She climbed into his lap like she'd been doing it her whole life, and Caleb wrapped his arms around her, marveling at how natural it felt. Somewhere along the way, without conscious decision, they'd become a family. Do you think Mama's happy now? Lucy asked. Wherever she is? I think she's at peace, and I think she's proud of you for being so brave. I don't feel brave. I feel sad and scared and angry all at the same time. That's what brave looks like sometimes. Not feeling those things, but feeling them and getting up the next morning anyway. Lucy was quiet for a while, then asked, Caleb, can I call you Pa? Or is that wrong since you're not really my father? The question hit him harder than expected. He thought about biological fathers who abandon their children, about men who earn the title through daily acts of care rather than accident of blood. He thought about a dying woman who'd trusted him with her most precious gift, and about a child brave enough to ask a stranger for love. I'd be honored if you called me Pa, he said, his voice rough. Because, Lucy, I might not be your father by birth, but I promise you I'll be your father by choice every single day for the rest of my life. She hugged him tighter, and Caleb felt something shift and settle in his chest, the final piece of a puzzle he hadn't known he was assembling. Winter passed slowly, but not unbearably. Caleb taught Lucy to set trap lines and skin pelts, skills she learned with characteristic determination. She taught him more French, and showed him the constellations her mother had named, keeping Evelyn's memory alive through the knowledge she'd passed down. They talked about Evelyn often, sharing memories and stories, laughing over her quirks and crying over what they'd lost. Caleb kept his promise to tell Lucy the full truth about her mother. Not a sanitized version, but the real woman with her strengths and weaknesses, her dreams and disappointments. On what would have been Evelyn's 32nd birthday, they walked to her grave carrying wildflowers they'd dried and saved from autumn. Lucy placed them on the snow-covered mound and told her mother about everything she'd learned that winter, about how Caleb was teaching her carpentry and she was teaching him to bake bread that didn't turn out like rocks. We're okay, Mama, Lucy said. You don't have to worry about us anymore. Pa's taking good care of me and I'm taking care of him. We're a family, like you wanted. Caleb stood with his hand on Lucy's shoulder, and for the first time since Evelyn died, he felt something other than grief. Hope, maybe, or at least the possibility of it. Spring came eventually, as it always did. The snow melted, revealing the grave marker Tom had carved over winter, a proper headstone with Evelyn's name and dates, and below them the words Lucy had chosen, she loved well. Caleb planted flowers around the grave, varieties that would bloom through summer and return each year. He built a bench nearby where he and Lucy could sit and talk to Evelyn when they needed to feel close to her. Samuel Parker helped Caleb improve the property that spring, showing him how to expand the garden and build proper pens for chickens and a milk cow they bought with money from selling pelts. The cabin that had been barely adequate became a real home through steady work and the determination to build something lasting. One evening in early summer, Caleb sat on the porch watching Lucy play in the yard, chasing fireflies in the gathering dusk. She was laughing, the sound pure and unguarded, and he realized with a start that it was the first time he'd heard her laugh like that since before Evelyn died. Martha Johnson had ridden over to deliver eggs and found him there. She followed his gaze to Lucy and smiled. She's healing. Children are resilient that way. She is. We both are, I think. Evelyn would be pleased to see this, to know her gamble paid off. Caleb looked at Martha. It was a gamble, wasn't it? Asking a stranger to marry her and raise her child. The biggest gamble there is, trusting someone with what matters most. But she saw something in you, Caleb, something worth betting on. Martha patted his arm. And she was right. After Martha left, Lucy came to sit beside Caleb on the porch steps, flushed and happy from her play. Pa, do you think Mama can see us from wherever she is? I don't know, Lucy. Maybe. I hope so. I think she can. And I think she's happy that we're happy, that we didn't just stop living when she died. Caleb pulled his daughter close. Your mama was the smartest woman I ever met. She knew exactly what she was doing when she asked me to stay. She was building something that would last beyond her, not just keeping you safe, but teaching both of us how to be a family. Lucy leaned against his shoulder. Do you think you'll ever get married again, for real this time, to someone who won't die? The question surprised him, but he considered it honestly. Maybe someday, if the right person came along and you approved of her. Would that be okay with you? Yeah, I think so. Mama told me before she died that she wanted you to be happy, not just exist, that your happiness would be part of her legacy. Lucy looked up at him. So if you found someone who made you happy, I think that would honor Mama's memory instead of disrespecting it. The wisdom of it, coming from a 9-year-old, made Caleb smile. When did you get so smart? I learned from Mama and from you. They sat together as the sun set and the stars began to appear. The same stars Evelyn had taught them to name, burning steadily in the darkening sky. Caleb thought about a question asked by a desperate child, about a dying woman who'd given him more than he'd given her, about the strange paths that lead us to exactly where we need to be. He thought about how he'd spent 2 years running from his past, convinced he was broken beyond repair. How it had taken a child's impossible question and a woman's quiet strength to show him that healing wasn't about forgetting the wounds, but about finding purpose bigger than the pain. Pa. Lucy's voice was drowsy now, the day's excitement catching up with her. Thank you for staying, for choosing us. Caleb kissed the top of her head, breathing in the smell of sunshine and wildflowers that clung to her hair. Thank you for asking me to, for being brave enough to hope when hope seemed foolish. It wasn't foolish, though, was it? The hoping. No, Lucy, it was the smartest thing any of us did. Years later, when people asked Caleb how he came to settle in the Colorado Territory with his daughter, he would tell them the truth, or as much of it as could be told in simple words. He'd tell them about a woman named Evelyn who taught him that staying was sometimes the bravest thing a man could do, about a child named Lucy who'd asked an impossible question and changed 3 lives by refusing to accept that love was something you had to earn rather than something you could simply ask for. He'd tell them about a wedding that lasted 3 weeks, and a marriage that endured through the daughter who carried her mother's courage forward into the world. He'd tell them about learning to be a father and a widower and a neighbor all at once, about finding home in the last place he'd expected to look. And sometimes, on clear nights when the stars burned bright over the mountains, he'd sit on that bench beside Evelyn's grave and tell her about Lucy's latest achievement or his own small victories. He'd thank her for trusting him with something precious, for seeing potential in a broken drifter and betting everything that he'd rise to meet it. Because that's what Evelyn had really asked for when her daughter posed that impossible question. Not salvation or rescue or romance, but something far more radical. She'd asked a stranger to witness her humanity, to acknowledge her worth by choosing to stand beside her when leaving would have been easier. And in doing so, she'd given Caleb the greatest gift anyone had ever given him, proof that he was more than the sum of his scars, that broken men could still build beautiful things, and that sometimes the family you choose matters more than the one you're born into. Lucy grew up strong and capable, educated and confident, carrying her mother's legacy forward with grace. She never forgot the woman who'd loved her enough to ask impossible things from strangers, or the man who'd loved them both enough to say yes. And Caleb Hart, the drifter who'd spent 2 years running from himself, finally stopped running. He'd found what he'd been searching for all along, though he hadn't known to name it until a child with ancient eyes asked him a question that changed everything. Will you marry my mother so she doesn't die sad? The answer had been yes, and in that yes, 3 broken people had found a way to become something whole.